Hello and welcome to today's special webinar event on bringing calling to Microsoft Teams, why businesses prefer UCaaS. Today's webinar is sponsored by RingCentral and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker, and I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, there are a few things that you should know. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. There are 5 great PDFs provided by RingCentral, including a detailed report from Metrigy called Microsoft Teams and Telephony, Why Businesses Prefer UCaaS Providers. I'd highly recommend downloading that one. It's the resource that much of today's discussion is based on. There are also PDFs about enhancing Teams with enterprise telephony, Cloud PBX for Microsoft Teams, and RingCentral for Microsoft Teams. So I encourage you to access those resources now, share them with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding one $300 Amazon gift card to a lucky attendee on the live event. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. And finally, one of the best benefits of an event like this is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact the prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's great content. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Esther Yoon, who's AVP of Product Marketing for RingCentral, and we have Erwin Lazar, who's President and Principal Analyst at Metrigy. So let me bring Esther and Erwin up on screen.
Hello.
Erwin and Esther, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Scott.
Well, Esther,
I will say that, sorry. I will say this is probably one of the webinars with the better prizes that I've seen. So I'm really impressed just off the Amazon gift cards. You won me over. I'm kind of like, dang, I should have been a participant. No, thank you. Thank you for having us. You know, this is a very topical discussion. You know, they're here because they're like, hey, there are some gaps within my Microsoft Teams experience when it comes to calling. And whether it be, you know, I want deeper app integrations, or I want, you know, better analytics, or I want to have, enhanced reliability or a larger global footprint. There are many reasons why people look to UCaaS vendors to power their telephony. So, you know, I'm from RingCentral. We get this question all the time, but I figured, who better to answer this and provide key considerations than an expert in the industry? So I'm so happy to pass this off to Erwin Lazar, who is from Metrigy, and he's going to share some of the key insights on how to navigate, you know, some of the key considerations when deploying telephony through a third-party vendor for Microsoft Teams. All right, take it away, Erwin.
Great. Thank you so much, Esther, and welcome to the webinar. I'm excited to have the opportunity to chat with you about a topic that's been probably one of the ones, if not the one, that I get the most questions from our clients and that I spend most of my time researching. So let me go ahead and pull up the slide here. So as Scott and Esther mentioned, the focus of this webinar is on looking at Microsoft Teams and specifically the role that UCaaS providers can play in supporting Microsoft Teams, and why we've seen in our research a clear preference for leveraging UCaaS as a means to bring calling and telephony into Microsoft Teams. So I'll go through some quick introductions. I'll share with you the source of our research. We'll talk about Microsoft Teams adoption, what we're seeing again in our research. And then we'll go through some of the requirements that we see that organizations need to think about as they're determining what is the correct calling approach, or the optimal calling approach as they go forward with a Microsoft Teams strategy, how UCaaS, Unified Communication as a Service providers, can support Microsoft Teams calling, and then how to evaluate and pick the right option. And we'll wrap up with some conclusions or recommendations. And as we mentioned earlier, please feel free to submit a question. We'll get to those as we have time at the end. So look forward to having an interactive discussion with you. So just quickly to introduce Metrigy and myself, we have covered the enterprise market now for as a company. We started a little over a year ago, but before that, we spun out of a company called Metrigy Research. So we've been covering the unified communications and collaboration space since about 2002 overall. We also cover contact center and so on. And really what I'm looking at in terms of my role and how I'll bring our research into this discussion is, as I mentioned, we go out to hundreds of companies every year. We gather data about what they're doing, why, what their experiences are, what their budgets are, what lessons they've learned, and most importantly, what are the characteristics of successful companies. So as we go through the discussion here, I'll share with you how we define success and then what we see as the different approaches that companies that are achieving success for their collaboration investments are taking versus those that are not having much in the way of success. So quickly to introduce our research, I mentioned we go out to hundreds of companies a year. The reference point for the data that I'll be sharing within this presentation is a study we published in the late third quarter, early fourth quarter of 2021, in which we went out to about 400 end user organizations ranging in size from about 10 employees up to thousands of employees across North America, Western Europe, Southeast Asia, and Australia. You can see the mean employee count is about 7,000. Average revenue is about 1.4 billion. So it tended to be a little bit more skewed to the mid and large size enterprise, but we also had a significant percentage of smaller companies in there as well. And we conduct our data through a combination of interviews and surveys. And again, our goal is to really be able to dig into not just reporting to you what the market is doing, but why it's doing it. And again, the differentiation that successful companies have. So let's talk a minute about success. And as we sit down with folks that are responsible for communication and collaboration strategies within the organization, we find three areas that have really dominated the discussion in terms of how do you measure the effectiveness of the investments you're making in collaboration applications. The first is, we want to deliver solutions that increase the ability of our company to make money. So allow us to work more efficiently together, to deliver new capabilities and features, to improve the responsiveness of sales teams. And so again, leveraging collaboration tools that hopefully generate positive impact on sales. The second is reduction of costs. And this often comes from consolidation, elimination of expensive on-premise infrastructure in exchange for moving to the cloud, moving to different services that allow you to achieve some reduction in operational costs. And then finally, the last one is improving productivity. So how do we support, especially now over the last couple of years, the needs of the hybrid workforce, make sure that no matter where someone is working, that they can effectively communicate and collaborate both internally as well as with customers. So these are the three areas that kind of govern a lot of the discussions that we're having as companies are thinking about what makes sense for them from a communication and collaboration strategy. So I mentioned, we defined a success group. We went through our 395 companies and we identified those that were actually measuring some of the value of their investment. Not everybody is, but we found about 54, 55% that were going back and looking at, what did I get for my investment in calling and messaging and meeting applications and so on. Then we looked at those who had above average gain or measured improvement in at least one of the three areas that I mentioned. So cost savings, revenue increase, or productivity gain. And that narrowed us down to about 68 companies that we put into our success group. These are the ones who had above average benefit associated with their collaboration investment. And you can see the different areas on the chart here and what the average per employee or overall, when you're talking about productivity improvement, was within the organization. So, the key takeaway here is, yes, there are companies that are achieving success, that are measuring success, and let's now look at what they do different as we go through the rest of the presentation. So the first area I want to talk about is what's happening with Microsoft Teams. Obviously, it's a very well deployed, very widely deployed application out there. Microsoft recently reported, I believe it was about 270 million people that are using Teams. majority of those are still using it as a messaging application. So within our research of our 395 companies, we found about 70% that were using Teams messaging and meetings, but only 6% that were using Teams as a calling platform. And that's been where we find that many enterprises are today. If they're using Teams today, it's predominantly using the Teams as their instant messaging and email replacement for group collaboration, taking advantage potentially of the meeting capabilities, but they're not quite ready to embrace Teams as a phone system or leverage the Microsoft capabilities. They're instead looking at what is the right path going forward. So how do I extend calling into the Teams client and into the Teams user population? And then what are my options for connecting Teams to the PSTN? So depending on which path I take in terms of calling, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail, that will govern the decision point going forward. So as we think about, that's where the market is today. Now, what do we need to think about? What do we need to address as we move into that Teams calling or integration of calling into the Teams ecosystem? So today, where most companies, as I mentioned, they're leveraging the messaging applications, they're using the meeting applications, and then the next goal is to say, all right, what's the optimal way potentially to bring calling into that Teams experience, and so that people can use the Teams client as their single application and ensure that they can get the kind of reliability and access to features and so on that they've come to expect from a modern calling platform. So let's pause here and let me put up a poll question and ask our audience, where are you today? Have you already added calling to Teams? Are you planning on doing so this year? Are you evaluating, no plans, or you haven't quite figured out a strategy yet? So we'll go ahead and put the results up as they come up. Looks like a few that have already added Teams calling. So we'll talk about, again, what the different options are there as we go forward. And about 20% with no plan, so that may change based on what you hear in the presentation to here. And it looks like about 29% or 27% that are evaluating adding. So let's go ahead and move on. So as you think about Teams calling, there's a number of requirements that you have to address. The first off is, what calling features do you need? Do you need things like advanced analytics and management features, SMS integration to allow you to send and receive messages from a single business phone number? Again, some of those analytics capabilities, call routing capabilities. Do you need contact or call center functionality, ideally integrated into that Teams environment? Noting that Microsoft doesn't provide their own call center outside of the Dynamics world. You certainly want to achieve cost minimization that we talked about earlier, cost avoidance and spending as little money as you can to deliver the kinds of features that you need to your user population. You may need global availability depending on the kind of organization you are, and you might need reach into worldwide countries. So that might include having local number access in not only larger countries, but even some smaller and remote countries. You certainly need reliability. You want to make sure that that phone system works and that it's manageable, and that if there is an issue that does occur, you can quickly troubleshoot and understand where that issue came from. You may need integrations with third-party applications, either off-the-shelf integrations that allow you to do things like extend calling into your CRM or into other business applications, or automatically log calls as they come in, conduct screen pops that would give somebody answering a call information about who that person is that's calling them. And then finally, you want to make things easy on the user population. So as ideally as possible, a simplified user experience so that people can intuitively figure out, okay, if I'm in, say, the Teams client, here's how I make a call. I don't need to learn something else or move between different applications or so on. So that's, kind of the core requirements that we see as companies are going through the evaluation process. So now let's spend a couple of minutes diving into what the options are and what you can do going forward. And there's really two core options that we want to focus on here. The first is integration of UCaaS provider capabilities directly into Microsoft Teams. So this would allow you to make calls from the Teams client. For the end user, it's a seamless experience, but those calls are still handled by the UCaaS provider. So you're getting access to all of the features, the reliability that we'll talk about in a little bit, the global reach and so on that a UCaaS provider can deliver that may not be natively available from Microsoft or depending on the Microsoft partner. So that again is approach number one. The second is there will be organizations will say, you know what, Microsoft has calling as a feature set, the Microsoft Teams phone system feature set. We'll talk a little bit more about the cost involved there. So if you want to use that, now you still have to think about how do I connect the Microsoft client to the PSTN, and there are a number of different options there. So these are the two areas, sort of those two inflection points. I think the first path you have to decide is, do I want to take advantage of the features that I can get from a UCaaS provider and some of the benefits that delivers that we'll go through in further detail, or do I want to use just the Microsoft's own calling capabilities if I have a more limited set of requirements, and then how to connect that out to the PSTN. So let's talk about how to pick the best option. And as we think about the different options that are out there, if we decide we're going to use Microsoft's calling plan or Microsoft phone system, Microsoft phone system is the feature set. We're going to leverage only the features that are available from Microsoft. We're going to trust and put essentially all our eggs in the Microsoft basket in terms of reliability. Alternatively, again, we can go with the UCaaS integration approach where we say, okay, we're going to work with a UCaaS provider like a RingCentral, and we're going to integrate their capabilities natively into the Microsoft Teams client. So from a user experience, it's a seamless integration. But from a back-end experience, those calls are still being handled by the UCaaS provider. You're still getting access to the feature sets, the additional capabilities that we talked about as well. So again, these are the kind of those two pathways that you can take. So if you decide, okay, we want to look at the Microsoft approach of enabling the Microsoft phone system feature set, that's going to require potentially some additional licensing. So I'm looking solely at enterprise licensing. There is another alternative plan for SMB licenses that Microsoft offers that's useful for roughly about 300 or less endpoints. But thinking about the enterprise calling plan, we found that roughly 60% of participants in our research have a Microsoft E3 license. About another 9% have an E1 license. Neither one of those licenses includes the phone system feature set natively. So in order to enable phone system as a feature within the Microsoft Teams app, you have to purchase an additional license, typically about $8, depending on, at least in the US, it'll vary in different parts of the world. So only about 11% have the E5 license, which actually already includes the calling capability. Within our success group, a little bit less percentage, about 50%. I mentioned that success group earlier was the 68 companies who had the highest ROI for their collaboration investment, slightly less that are using those licenses. So overall, only about 10% of companies in our pool of research had the phone system feature license already, meaning again, additional expense to equip with the Microsoft license. And as we dig more deeply in, again, looking at, do we want to add Microsoft phone system features to our existing license and pay the extra license fee, or do we want to use a UCaaS provider and incorporate or integrate their capabilities into the Microsoft Teams client? There's a number of different areas that you have to evaluate. So the calling features are typically going to be more widely available within the UCaaS provider. They're typically a much more mature set of calling features. They will often have things like SMS as an example. They'll also typically have a wider set of integrations, either native or third party through APIs. They will typically have a contact center offering. The UCaaS providers usually have their own, again, fairly mature or very mature contact center offering as part of their solution that they can incorporate into the Teams environment. With Microsoft, there is a limited contact center feature set now available within Dynamics, or you have to use a third party if you want a fuller set of contact features. I mentioned about $8 a month is the typical base price to add phone system to the Microsoft license. Where with, and then beyond that, you also still need to pay for PSTN access, where with the UCaaS provider, you might get a single bundled license that includes calling features as well as PSTN access, and that'll vary based on the plan that you're looking at. Currently, Microsoft offers about 33 countries through their own PSTN connectivity. It's called Microsoft Calling Plan. And then they also have partnerships with a number of certified SIP trunking providers to go out to a wider set of countries. With the UCaaS providers, they will typically natively, again, provide support for over 100 countries, again, for direct local access without having to potentially pay long distance fees for local numbers in those markets. And again, the advantage there is that you're going to a single provider who gives you the PSTN connectivity, gives you the additional features, and then can support the needs of your large organization if you are a larger organization. Mentioned on the feature side, calling and integration with Microsoft apps typically is native if you're in the phone system world. If you're using the UCaaS provider, again, having the ability to take advantage of SMS, call recording, fax, advanced analytics for call utilization, and the continual development and addition of new features that we see almost on a weekly or monthly basis into the calling capability certainly happens at a very accelerated rate in the UCaaS world. The reliability one is another big area of concern. Microsoft will provide a guarantee of 99.99% reliability, which is about 52.6 minutes per year of unscheduled downtime, where your typical UCaaS provider will provide 5 nines reliability, which is about 5.26 minutes a year of unscheduled downtime. So, that seemed like a lot, but that could be very disruptive. More importantly is if you're using every feature from Microsoft, if there is an outage, you lose calling, you lose messaging, you lose meetings, where if you're using a UCaaS provider, if there's a Microsoft outage, your calling solution still works, and you might have if you have desktop phones, those will continue to work. So you have that broader set of diversity that will protect you again in an outage situation. And then on the user experience, again, typically it's going to be the Teams client. If it's the phone system feature set from Microsoft, it'll be natively integrated. If it's a UCaaS provider, depending on the provider, it will typically be natively integrated as well. So from a user perspective, they don't really have to do anything different in order to make a call from the Teams client. So we also gathered a lot of data on cost, and this is where the different approaches really start to show a differentiation. Excuse me. So we looked at the cost of on a variety of different factors that companies were spending. And so on average, Microsoft was costing the average participant in our research about $1,500 a year per person in operational costs. Big cost there in terms of licensing, staffing, power for running potentially on-prem gateways and SB session border controllers if you're using Microsoft Direct Routing through a third party. PSTN access costs significantly higher versus the average of all UCaaS providers. And again, obviously, there are going to be differences based on the UCaaS provider, but on average, the median price for a UCaaS provider was around $1,200 per person per year across all of these costs. You can see the big areas. There were some areas where Microsoft is a little bit cheaper than average, so maintenance, managed services, those green numbers in the middle, but you can see some areas where they were significantly more expensive in terms of licensing, staffing costs, power and PSTN access costs. So if you extrapolate this now into a business case, and you say, okay, we've got 1,000-person company, say if they go the Microsoft phone system route, they're spending almost $1,500 per user per year. If they're using an average UCaaS provider to deliver calling into that Microsoft environment, they're spending about $1,200 per person per year. That equates to about $301,000 per year to bring calling to Microsoft, a difference of $301,000 if you use the Microsoft phone system with either, say, calling plan or direct routing, or you use the UCaaS provider. So the $301,000 savings for using an average UCaaS provider is pretty significant, especially for, again, 1,000-person company. So if you've decided, okay, you've read through all this and you said, okay, you know what, we really still want to go with Microsoft phone system. We think just having everything from Microsoft makes life simpler, even if it's more expensive. Then you still have two options, which are two decisions that you have to make. Actually, one decision you have to make. How am I going to connect Microsoft phone system to the PSTN? So you have two options here. One is you can get PSTN access from Microsoft. It's called Microsoft Calling Plan. It varies in cost, whether you want domestic or international minutes. Here in the US, it's I believe the current rate was about $14 per user per month for 3,000 minutes for domestic calling, and $24 if you want international calling. It varies greatly outside of the US, and it may not even be available in parts of the world. So like, for example, in Australia, you have to go through a Microsoft partner to get PSTN access. but in that case, again, Microsoft's providing everything in terms of the phone numbers, the dial plan management, 911 access, and so on. Alternatively, you can decide, you know what, I don't want to use Microsoft Calling Plan because I'm not sure we're going to need that many minutes. It's significantly more expensive in our research than going the direct routing route. So I can say, you know what, I'm going to bring my own PSTN connectivity to Microsoft. And I can do this through Microsoft Direct Routing, where I'm working with providers that are certified with Microsoft. I can do it through the recently announced Operator Connect, where I'm picking providers directly from within the Microsoft Teams management console. And if I've already got SIP contracts, SIP trunking, I need services in areas where Microsoft might not support it. You know, this is a popular approach. We find about 80% of folks that are going the Microsoft Teams phone system route that are using direct routing, because it's often cheaper. It's often supports connectivity and services where Microsoft lacks capabilities of their own. And in that case, you know, again, as I mentioned, so it's about 70%, I'm sorry, I was a little off, of companies that are saying, you know what, out of those two choices, I'm going to go with direct routing. Only about 17% in our last study that said that they were using calling plan. The rest were either going with direct routing from one provider, best in region providers, managed service provider, and so on. Now, another option here is if you're looking at the UCaaS providers, most of them now offer direct routing, and we'll get into where we're seeing that in a second. So why do people go with direct routing? As I mentioned, it's significantly cheaper than Microsoft Calling Plan. On average, about $7.9 or $7.91 per user per month for direct routing is what we found in our research, and that comes because direct routing is often, you know, you're not buying a bundle of minutes, you're typically paying for what you use. And again, those service providers offer significantly lower cost points. Sometimes they even bill in a fraction of a minute, or again, just on the per minute is usually the common approach. Some companies may want to control their own phone numbers, be able to control their own call routing, be able to leverage multiple providers. So maybe they're using Calling Plan or a Microsoft phone system plus someone else for contact center. And again, areas where Microsoft might not support geographic reach, or you have contracts you can't get out of, or you may not want to get out of. So overall, again, we see a lot of interest in the direct routing approach. Now, what we also looked at, as I mentioned, most of the UCaaS providers now offer their own direct routing capabilities. So you could go to someone again here like a RingCentral and or Microsoft phone system, and we're going to take advantage of the Microsoft phone system feature set. Again, you know, at a higher cost with the risks that we talked about. But now you can still use, say, a RingCentral or a UCaaS provider as the direct routing provider. And when we asked participants who were using Microsoft Teams for messaging, but using a UCaaS provider for calling, if they plan to continue to take advantage of that UCaaS provider, or if they plan to abandon the UCaaS provider and move fully to Microsoft, we found only 12.2% that said, you know what, we're going to give up our UCaaS provider. 60.7% of those that were using UCaaS providers also use Microsoft for messaging and often sometimes meetings. But again, of those that are using a UCaaS provider for calling and maybe even contact center, maybe again, even additional functionality, only 12% said that, you know what, we're going to give those up and we're going to move over to Teams phone system. So that tells you that the vast majority of folks who are using a UCaaS provider and also using Teams for messaging and maybe meetings, you know, want to keep that split. They for all the reasons we talked about earlier: cost, reliability, features, geographic reach, and so on. And then we also looked at, okay, if you're using Microsoft Teams phone system and the phone system feature sets, would you consider using your UCaaS provider for direct routing? So that in that case, you may end up with a split environment where you've got some people in your company that maybe they don't need the advanced feature sets, so they might be using just Microsoft phone system. And then others where they do need the greater feature sets, where they're using calling features from the UCaaS provider. And so we found of the participant pool, already about 17% were using a UCaaS provider as their direct routing partner. about another 6% that we're planning on doing so by the end of last year, about 23% this year, and 17% that are evaluating. So, that adds up to a pretty clear majority. It's about 45.7 that are using in planning, and another 17% that are evaluating. And so again, in this scenario, what you're doing is you're using the Microsoft phone system features. You're paying that extra $8 a month in license, but you're continuing to use your UCaaS provider to provide PSTN functionality, and again, take advantage of value-added services that they deliver, contact center features, and even the ability to have users who are predominantly using the UCaaS endpoint capabilities, whether that's a desktop phone or integration within Microsoft. So with that, let's wrap up with some conclusions and recommendations. So, again, I think the first decision point that you have to make is, what do I want to use to bring calling into Microsoft Teams? Again, assuming that's your goal. And do I want to blend in features from a UCaaS provider through the integrations that they deliver and continue to use that UCaaS provider, get access to higher reliability, lower costs, a wider set of features, and so on? Or do I want to use the Microsoft Teams phone system feature set because I just want everything to be Microsoft, even if I have to pay extra for it? So that's really decision point number one. If you decide that you're going to use UCaaS, then you want to look at how easily does that UCaaS provider integrate into the Microsoft environment. So for those people who are using Microsoft Teams, that they can make calls through the Teams client, that they can get integrations into third-party applications, all as easily as possible from an end user perspective. If you've decided you're going the Microsoft Teams phone system route, then you have to decide, how am I going to connect the Teams client or the Teams phone system to the PSTN? And again, you can take advantage of direct routing or Operator Connect, BYOC approaches, or Teams calling plan where you're buying minutes and phone numbers from Microsoft. If you're going that direct routing approach, again, take a look at the UCaaS providers and what they offer. Certainly, if you have an existing relationship with a UCaaS provider, look at what features are available, look at the reliability, the cost, the global availability, user experience, all those things we talked about earlier. Our research has I think, clearly demonstrated that UCaaS is cheaper and provides more features. It provides greater reliability than simply going with Microsoft phone system and Microsoft calling plan. So, again, that's a decision point you'll have to make and as you do your own due diligence. If you decide, though, you are going to go with Microsoft Teams phone system, take a look at the UCaaS providers for direct routing as a means to continue to get access to some of those advanced features, integrate contact center, provide higher reliability than what would be natively offered from Microsoft, and also the geographic reach, as we talked about earlier. So with that, I think Scott will call you back in. We'll run another poll and then answer some questions.
All right. Sounds good, Erwin. And I want to say, a ton of great information. I really appreciated your breakdown of the 4 nines versus 5 nines with the added wrinkle of, when you're calling through Microsoft and it's down, all your communications are probably down during that period as well. I mean, that's a great point. And I also want to take this opportunity to encourage everyone to download Erwin's 13-page PDF report from the handouts tab to drill into this data. A couple of people were asking about slides, and while the slides aren't available, so much of the data that Erwin, that you presented here is in that report. So I just really want to highlight that that's available for everybody. And I did want to bring Esther back on as well for some of these questions on the RingCentral side. And actually, the first question I've got, Esther, is for you. What are some of the solutions that RingCentral offers for Microsoft Teams calling?
Yeah. Oh, there we go. So
Yep.
RingCentral offers two different options, very similar to what Erwin said, but I will say the main difference that we have is for our native integration, it is a very, very deep embedded dialer experience. So typically customers come to us either for one, they want to expand their global footprint, have deeper integrations. We are absolutely well known for our next gen analytics and reporting. So when you kind of look at that, there's two options. You can go direct routing, which if you don't have that E5 license, is an extra $8 per user. So a lot of our customers, and what we typically recommend is to download or to get a RingCentral license and use the embedded dialer experience. So you can really have some massive cost savings by avoiding that extra $8 per license. And you get the full RingCentral reliability, the global trust, all the really cool bells and whistles, right, for your power user all the way to your basic kind of basic calling user. So we have two tracks. We seriously recommend the embedded dialer, especially if you're looking to have that like extremely powerful advanced PBX capabilities, but also want to weave it in natively within your team's experience.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for breaking down those two tracks. Appreciate it. This next one here is for Erwin. Wondering, do the costs that you presented change based on the size of the company?
Yeah, certainly there are economies of scale at work. So within the Microsoft licensing domain, if you're adding just the phone system feature set, it's $8 a month for E1, E3 licenses. It's included in the E5 license. I saw a question about audio conferencing. That's a $4 add-on for meetings in the E1 and E3 license, and included in the E5 license as well. Where the economies of scale typically come into play is if you're thinking about the PSTN connectivity piece. So if you're going with a direct routing provider, again, the larger your organization, the likelihood that you can reduce the individual costs of access.
Okay, super. This next question, I guess this comes from Bradford, and this is for Esther. Does the installation of RingCentral require a full-time on-site administrator position, or does that vary by a number of endpoints and services?
It really varies, and it varies on multiple things. It varies on whether you want to or not. It's possible, like especially in the SMBs, you don't need a full-time on-site admin, right? When you get into the larger enterprise and you're looking at, leveraging our APIs to build custom work streams, and you have very complex endpoint deployments all over the globe, then you start to get a little bit more resource intensive, and we see a lot of organizations. Have dedicated resources that are, kind of like a UC manager within the IT function. But yeah, no, RingCentral, I mean, we're full cloud communications, which means, even my mom, who's kind of technically not that savvy, she can deploy RingCentral in minutes. So it really depends on how complex and how sophisticated you want your deployment to be. RingCentral also does offer professional services. So if that's something that you're like, hey, I kind of want a white glove service, that's on the table as well as for an added cost.
Okay, super. This next question is for Erwin. The question is, how does Operator Connect fit into the options for bringing calling to Teams?
Yeah, so Operator Connect was something that Microsoft introduced last year, and what it allows you to do as a Teams customer is, if you've decided you're going to use the Microsoft Teams phone system and you've purchased the appropriate licenses, that you can go and buy PSTN connectivity through a limited set of Microsoft partners directly through the Teams Operator console. So you can essentially go and say, I'm going to pick this partner, I need this many phone numbers, and away you go. We have seen that largely focused at the SMB environment or greenfield companies that don't have relationships with service providers today. So it is an attractive option, I think, for smaller organizations as an alternative to Microsoft Calling Plan. So it's typically going to be a cheaper alternative. But we haven't seen that that's really what the large enterprise market is looking at, mid to large size companies.
Okay, great. Also, Erwin, you mentioned some feature differences with using UCaaS with Teams. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the one that comes up the most is SMS. Most of the UCaaS providers will provide the ability to send and receive text from your phone numbers. The ability to leverage third-party integrations is usually a more widely available capability within the UCaaS provider space as well. Fax is one that's not natively offered by Microsoft that I'm aware of. Trying to think some of the other ones. Again, you think about things like call recording, call analytics. A lot of that is typically going to be part of a UCaaS feature set, but might not necessarily be available within the Teams features.
Okay, super. And you probably noticed I did put the poll up here. Just what are some of the pain points that you're trying to address by adding calling to Microsoft Teams? So there's a bunch of options on there. If you can answer that, we'd really appreciate it. And I think we've gone through a lot of the questions, Esther. I think we've sort of run through most of them. But if somebody wants to get started with RingCentral or find out more, what do you recommend?
Well, first, I would recommend, going to the handout section, digesting the really great information that Erwin shared, and really internalizing, hey, what's the best strategy, and like, why are you looking? What are the core challenges that you want to solve by outsourcing calling to a UCaaS vendor? With that said, if you have any questions or you want to get in contact with somebody at RingCentral, honestly, just go to ringcentral.com, and if you click one of the contact sales buttons, someone will get in touch with you immediately. You can also just chat with our bot, which pops up. So that's a really great way. If you have an existing relationship with one of our account executives or CSMs, reach out to them as well. But lots of different ways. First place, ringcentral.com.
Okay, super. And I just want to thank both Erwin and Esther for a really informative presentation today and for all the insights in the Q&A. And just one last call to give people the opportunity to download that report. It's really a great report, and it's sitting right there for you. So grab it and share it with your friends. So I just want to take this opportunity, Esther and Erwin. Thanks a lot for being on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to move on to the prize drawing. So the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing today, the winner is John Chung from California. So congratulations to John, and we'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I do want to thank RingCentral for making this event possible. And thanks always to all of you for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. We will see you next time.